Thanks a lot. Thanks, Bartosz, for organizing the whole conference and for having me. So, starting with the aim of my talk, it is often said that the differences between what's called the second and the third wave of cognitive behavioral therapy are only philosophical. And in this talk, I'd like to identify some of these philosophical differences, focusing on the processes, especially focusing on the processes of diffusion and cognitive restructuring. In particular, I'd like to take a look at these differences, which originate from different characterizations of the nature and organization of our beliefs, that are the differences in the philosophical theories that are underlying the second and the third wave approaches. And it is my hope that the awareness of these differences might prove helpful when deciding to combine these two processes, namely diffusion and cognitive restructuring, in one's therapeutic practice, or refraining to combine them, or combine them to some extent. So yeah, I just hope that these kind of considerations might help you be kind of more aware of what are we doing when we are combining or not these two processes. And before I actually start, let me mention two caveats. The first one, even though I'll be highlighting the differences between diffusion and cognitive restructuring, of course, it's not the case that I'm making an argument for the claim that they cannot be combined at all. That would be rather reckless, especially if we take into consideration the fact that diffusion originated historically from the technique of distancing, already present in the classical cognitive therapy. If you are interested in these correlations, I highly recommend a paper by Zettel, in which it's very nicely presented how there was distancing in cognitive therapy, and then there was what was called comprehensive distancing, and then from it, somehow the current shape of diffusion in ACT emerged. So a great paper if you're interested in this kind of historical landscape. The second caveat, what I'll be speaking about in this presentation mostly concerns all our beliefs. So it's not only about, maladaptive, dysfunctional, problematic beliefs, or beliefs associated with some kind of mental suffering or a particular diagnosis. And this is a common kind of philosophical strategy. So the assumption is that if we get a better understanding on how do beliefs work kind of in general, maybe we'll be able to better grasp how do problematic beliefs work. And if we get how the problematic beliefs work, maybe we will be able to kind of have a better grasp on what can we and what cannot we actually achieve in therapeutic processes, right? All right, so these were the caveats. Let's introduce our protagonists, starting with cognitive restructuring. So there's, of course, plenty of different definitions of both cognitive restructuring and diffusion in the literature. I picked two of both. I'm not sure whether there is like the definition of either of these processes, but I think that we can kind of zero in on what we are talking about, mentioning these definitions here. So first, cognitive restructuring is a technique or a process of modifying beliefs through the review or production of evidence that contradicts negative or maladaptive conclusions drawn by a client. So we are modifying beliefs through the production of evidence. Another definition, cognitive restructuring, is designed to directly modify specific thoughts, patterns, or beliefs that purportedly mediate maladaptive behavioral and emotional responding. So again, direct modification of thought patterns, cognitions, and beliefs. Diffusion, on the other hand, means uncoupling or disentangling words and thoughts from the actual events that such words and thoughts refer to. The aim of diffusion is to loosen a client's tendency to treat verbal evaluative processes of language as being equivalent with the actual experience that the language refers to. The goal is to help clients create distance between what is and what their mind says that is. So again, we have this distancing here. In this case, it's the distancing between our cognitive and linguistic activity and the way it actually maps on the reality, on the events in the world. And therefore, if we realize that the mappings are very often arbitrary and dependent on our strategies, we might change the context and change the way our cognitions influence our behavior. A slightly more technical definition of diffusion. Diffusion aims to minimize the influence of verbal relations, so these relations between generated by language and cognition, such as thoughts, on behavior, and then when doing so leads to, in cases, I mean, it's applied in cases when we assess that when doing so leads to adaptive behavior and valued living. Good, but now, we already kind of know what we're talking about, but let's take a step back and ask ourselves, what are beliefs like in the first place? And here I'm, in the psychological literature, I think that beliefs are often used interchangeably with thoughts, at least sometimes, at least most of the time. I'm not gonna get into like whether there are good ways to differentiate them. Probably, philosophers spend a lot of time thinking about stuff like that. It might be not so relevant for the purpose of the present talk, but I think that this kind of first take on beliefs might be helpful. So let's take a mundane belief. I believe that the conference takes place on Sunday. And it seems that there are kind of two components to what's going on here. So there's the attitude component and the content component, right? So if I believe that the conference takes place on Sunday, I have a specific sort of attitude towards this content that the conference takes place on Sunday. But of course, belief is not the only attitude we can have towards a given content. I can suppose that the conference takes place on Sunday. I can imagine that the conference takes place on Sunday. I can, sometimes I hope that the conference takes place on Sunday and I, didn't make a mistake and it's not that everyone's waiting for my talk on Saturday, so just somewhere else, chilling with my friends. So the question is, the question might be, what is so special about the attitude of belief? And, there are different ways of kind of approximating what's this special thing about beliefs, but it's typically taken to be the case that beliefs are the type of attitude that we have towards contents that we take to be true, right? So we can think about it in terms of betting behaviors. I will be probably inclined to bet quite a lot of money on the fact that the conference takes place on Sunday. If I believe that the conference takes place on Sunday, probably less money. If I only suppose that the conference takes place on Sunday, if I only imagine, I'll probably lose a lot of money. People lose a lot of money in this way, imagining that their poker hand is strong and stuff like that. So the idea is that, that the goal of beliefs is to track the truth, right? So in a way, beliefs are these kinds of attitudes that help us navigate in the reality, and we are supposed to, you know, change our beliefs and shape our beliefs in such a way that we keep being more or less oriented towards the truth. And what's important, I think, just to mention, especially to the crowd that's trained in ACT and RFT, we don't have to have a very strong definition of truth here for this kind of approximation of what beliefs are to be correct. So it doesn't have to be, you know, that truth, that correspondence truth that is criticized by Stephen Hayes in more philosophical papers. It's enough. It's, you know, it's something that we are taking to be the truth. We are behaving as if something is the truth. All right. So now, what are the models of the philosophical models of the organization and nature of beliefs underlying different approaches? And I would like to suggest that the model underlying the classical cognitive therapy is something that can be called the representationalist unificationist model. It's not that important that you know, the specific name for that. I think that it might ring some bells in the minds of people who are trained in philosophy. But what's important, and the name is not important, the characterization is important. So this kind of model is something that we typically have in mind when we use the metaphors of, for example, the net of beliefs or the box of beliefs. So, you know, there are beliefs and they are all in this box and they interact in some ways with each other. In what ways? So here's the characterization. So first, the idea is that beliefs are mental entities which are stored in the single database. So them being mental entities is this representationalist part. So there are these things, representations, and they are stored somewhere in our mind, brain, memory, what have you, and they are stored in this database. And the unificationist part is just responsible for the assumption that it's a single database. So, you know, each of us have a single database, and if all our beliefs are there and they are interacting, it's probably the consistency between all of them might be important for thinking about ourselves, especially thinking about ourselves as rational. I will mention it in the next slide. Another assumption in this model is that the revision of a particular belief depends on and influences the whole net of beliefs. So these assumptions will be very important. We'll see it in work in just a minute. And finally, the assumption that probably some beliefs are more central, which means that more would have to change in the whole net of beliefs for us to revise these particular beliefs. And this is something that probably sounds familiar because this is something that's at the background of the idea of core beliefs, the beliefs that are in the centers of belief schemas. And, you know, more elements would have to be moved first for us to even get to these beliefs, and then to revise them. Oh boy, a lot of work. So I mentioned that in this model, there is quite a strict relation between beliefs and rationality. The idea is that rationality requires the consistency among our beliefs. So, for example, if I believe that the conference takes place on Sunday, I shouldn't simultaneously believe that the same conference takes place on Tuesday. Something would be off if it was the case about me. But also, if I believe that the conference takes place on Sunday, but I receive an email from Bartosz saying that the conference takes place on Tuesday, and an important assumption is that Bartosz is an authority regarding when the conference takes place. It's rational for me to drop or revise the belief that the conference takes place on Sunday and acquire a new belief that the conference takes place on Tuesday. So we already see these elements of the kind of mechanistic correlation between beliefs. You know, the rational strategy would be to take one belief, remove it, and place another belief, put another belief in its place. Just a small note before I move on. It's important, maybe it's important, or maybe it's just interesting, to notice that the rationality in the sense of rational emotive therapy of Albert Ellis is a slightly different thing than what I'm presenting here. So if you're interested, I highly recommend this volume from 2010 on rational and irrational beliefs. Plenty of interesting papers on, you know, how should we actually understand the rationality there. Just a small heads up on what's there in the papers that Ellis contributed to before he died. He's mentioning that he's not after this very philosophical or logical notion of rationality, and maybe it would have been better to use another terms from the very beginning, from the very origins of rational emotive behavior therapy. For example, not rational versus irrational beliefs, but I think he's mentioning functional versus dysfunctional. So he himself says that he is not after this very strict rationality. But yeah, this is just a side note. I think that it might be interesting, especially that probably in the crowd trained mainly in psychology, not so much in philosophy. Maybe the rational bit again rings certain bells and might be associated with Albert Ellis. So let's see the model at work. Let's take a look at a passage from a text by Hoffman and Asmundsson, so that you don't have to believe me that this is how it works again according to the second wave, but you can see it. So the idea is that patients in CBT, this is an important text, by the way, because this is a text and very helpful for someone like me who's curious about, you know, the philosophical underpinnings of the whole discussion. Because here in this paper, Hoffman and Asmundsson, they try to kind of answer the first round of objections of this third wave against the second wave. So what they say is that patients in CBT are encouraged to generate hypotheses based on their beliefs or theories about the world, themselves, and their future. This approach is combined with the Socrates method, in which a series of questions are posed to help a person determine their underlying beliefs. And now, by falsifying these hypotheses, patients are then forced to revise their belief system, reducing the emotional distress. So, as I mentioned, if we think about beliefs as being organized in these very strict and stiff nets of correlations, we might make an assumption that, for example, if you generate an evidence that contradicts one of my beliefs, I'm forced to remove this belief because it has been contradicted by strong evidence and acquire a new belief in its place. It's also, I think, interesting to take a look at another passage in this paper. So answering to the, again, third wave's objections to the classical CBT or CT, Asmundsson and Hoffman say something like that. They say that the computer metaphor, out with the bad, in with the good, mechanistic approach is inaccurate. All right, that sounds right. But now the question is, why do they think it is inaccurate? Because CBT is not synonymous with training in positive thinking. And the goal of CBT is not to replace bad cognitions with good cognitions. CBT encourages patients to adopt a scientific approach and to re-examine the accuracy of their predictions, perceptions, and interpretations. If the patient's emotional response is due to an unrealistic assessment of the situation, the CBT therapist will encourage to identify, re-examine, and correct these cognitions. However, if there is good reason to be sad, angry, fearful, worried, and so forth, the CBT therapist will not attempt to change these adaptive responses. So out with the bad, in with the good is not a good metaphor, but the reason, apparently, why it's not a good metaphor is because these bad and good parts. So it's not that it's always that we have some arbitrary bad and arbitrary good, and it's always, you know, what we are removing are bad things, what we are putting in are good things. But I think that the tension with the third wave approach remains because, and this is my assumption, what third wave theoretician would say is wrong with this metaphor is the out and in part. So the problem is not, you know, that we are removing the bad and putting in the good. The problem is that we are trying to remove anything and put something else in its place. So my kind of association, what I started thinking about when I was trying to visualize this kind of approach is this belief curling. I don't know whether you are familiar with the beautiful and noble sport of curling. The idea there is that there are two teams that are, you know, pushing the stones on the surface of ice and you know, sweeping the ice in front of the stones. And the goal is to place your stones as close to the center of this this bullseye. I believe it's called the button in curling. So you're trying to put your stones as close to the center as possible, ideally knocking out the stones of your opponent. So this mechanistic idea of let's take the beliefs we like and place them as close to the center of our belief systems, ideally knocking out the ugly beliefs about the fact that my life is a failure and stuff like that, feels a lot, at least to me, as the kind of belief curling. And I think that the belief curling might be problematic from the perspective of the philosophical assumptions of the third wave. So it's not the quality of beliefs or the nature of beliefs or the content of beliefs. Is the very fact that what we are trying to do is to knock something out and knock something else in. Why? Well, because the organization of beliefs in ACT and RFT, it has different features. So we all know these assumptions: human language and cognition, and by extension, most psychopathology is dependent on the human ability to arbitrarily relate events, right? So I can see someone handing a piece of paper to someone else, and I can interpret it as payment or the act of paying, right? This is an arbitrary relation thanks to my cognition and interpretation of what's going on. I can also interpret it as a bribery, all kinds of things. These relationships are made up of cognitive networks that can be elaborated, but not extinguished. So, you know, in the relational framing literature, there's also a lot of talking about nets and networks, but it's important to realize that the nets and networks in RFT, they are not these stiff constructs that have very concrete places, and we can take something out from one place and put somewhere else. You know, it's the act of relating and creating this network. It's all a constant process of putting things in relations with other things. And what's important is there is no this element of knocking out anything, because the assumption is that it's very difficult, if not impossible, to extinguish any part of the net. You know, it remains there. So the claim is that the direct attempts to change such networks only lead to further elaboration of the network while increasing its functional importance. So we might even, you know, direct our attention to something that we don't like if we are trying to get rid of it. So it's not the case that in this model, beliefs are mental entities stored in a single database. They are probably not mental entities. and it's not clear that there's an especially single database that they are stored in. It's also not that clear that the revision of a particular belief depends on and influences the whole net of beliefs. Maybe, well, maybe it influences our relational framing because kind of everything we do changes the context and therefore influences, you know, the whole process of framing. But it's not this kind of strict influence. It's not, you know, let me remove this piece and I'll achieve the certain kind of outcome that I can easily predict. And also it's not so obvious, I believe, that some beliefs are more central. Maybe, you know, certain elements play more important functions in the act of relational framing. Maybe some are central for certain purposes, but, you know, again, I don't see how we can achieve this kind of confidence and stability and in the model of our belief structure as it was in the representationalist unificationist model. So to take a look at the original RFT book, the idea there is that a strongly held belief is a basis for action. Now, in the cognitive model, action occurs because one believes a verbal formulation. But in the RFT model, a verbal formulation can be considered a belief because contextual features support action with regard to it. So the direction kind of interpretation is different. This insight is important because RFT suggests that believability, so this important quality of certain contents, can be quickly reduced by changing the contexts in which troublesome thoughts occur. So when I started thinking about, you know, is there a clear example of philosophical theory about the nature of beliefs that RFT nicely maps on, I started thinking about dispositionalism, and I think that you know, especially dispositionalism in context might be something as what we are after. So the idea would be that when we ascribe beliefs, what actually matters is the pattern of one's actual and potential behavior. What do we mean by that? So let's take someone who believes that the conference will take place on Sunday. Who is this person? I mean, what can we expect from this person? Well, probably this is someone who answers on Sunday when asked, when does the conference take place, right? It is also someone who buys a ticket for Saturday if they want to arrive a day before the conference. It's also someone who puts conference in their calendar under the heading Sunday, and so on and so forth, right? So the idea is that the beliefs are not these representational entities, they are dispositions of the whole organism to behave in certain ways. Again, to have a belief that P is to be, that P stands for whatever content you like, is to be disposed to behave, again, as if P was true, right? So, you know, I'll be behaving in a different way if I believe that P is true or if I believe that P is false. But actually, so dispositionalism is, I think, close to what we might have in mind while talking about the beliefs in RFT. But I think that something that's called interpretationism might be maybe even closer. So I'm a great fan of this Act Root to Fruit podcast by Marcel Tassara. So shout out to him. Great work. I'm a great fan. And only last week he had this episode, I think the first of 2 episodes with Steve Hayes. And one thing that Steve said was this phrase, cognition parses the behavioral stream. And, you know, part of my context was the fact that I was thinking about how to prepare the presentation for today. So one thing that came to my mind when I've heard this cognition parses the behavioral stream is that this is kind of exactly what we mean by beliefs in this more dispositionalist or interpretationist approach. So the idea is that beliefs are not some things in our mind or brain, right? If I open your head, there's no clear residue of beliefs. Even if we are interpreting, how memory works, it's not clear that we are able to identify particular beliefs. So what is there is, and if we look at behaving organisms, there's just this stream of behavior. There are just behaviors. And this is our activity, and this is what cognition does, to kind of divide this stream of behaviors into chunks that make sense to us, or that we want to use to make sense of what people are doing. So the idea is that we as observers ascribe beliefs to interpret patterns of behavior of organisms. And this is something that's already present in the philosophical literature. It's popularized by the philosopher Daniel Dennett, who says that if we take the intentional stance, if we for certain organisms, human beings, it makes sense to interpret them as having certain beliefs, because this is a good way of making sense of a lot of things they are doing. But it doesn't mean that they have beliefs somewhere planted in their brains. It means that again, it's our cognition that parses their behaviors into chunks that make sense as interpreted by the lens of them having beliefs, or them having desires, or something like that. Here's another analogy. Again, it maybe that helps me more to think about these things than it will help the audience, but let me try and speak about it for a moment. So this is, I believe, another anatomical analogy to what we are talking about when we're talking about this cognition parsing the stream of behaviors. So here's a slightly provocative question. Are there deltoid muscles? And well, it seems that the answer is obvious. Of course, there are all kinds of muscles. We have, I don't know, deltoids, we have pecs, we have biceps, we all that, we've learned that. But then if we think about it, there's another kind of approach we can assume towards this question. And we actually start thinking about what is there under our skin. It's like this, is this one big bag construed out of muscles connected by the connective tissue called fascia. And it's all like one very big bag that's called the myofascial system of, connective tissues and all kinds of stuff. And a lot of people, especially those who are assuming this more holistic approach to, treatment of human muscular problems, they say that actually a concept of muscle is a concept that's created with a scalpel, right? So, there are no separated elements that I have, like presented here. It's not that there's a skeleton and he has, or she has this deltoids on her arms. Is that from the big system of muscles and fascia, we decided to distinguish certain elements, and we for example, picked deltoids, for various reasons. We can think about their function, their construction. But then even if we think about their function, it's probably, I don't have clear data on that, but I believe that there might be close to zero things that deltoids do by themselves, right? If we think about the functioning of the system, it's always deltoids as being engaged with other muscles and fascia to do certain things. So this is something that helps me kind of think about this philosophically challenging claim. Cognition parses the behavioral stream, because so the idea is the same. Cognition, our interpretation, serves as this kind of scalpel that we use to kind of cut out an element of the big stream of just things happening, right? And we do it for certain purposes, for the purposes of interpretation. It helps us to make sense of the world. Probably without these tools, we would be totally lost. But again, let's be honest, this is a kind of our interpretative activity. It's not that, you know, there's a green light turned on in the reality when we detect that, yeah, this was the belief, or this is the muscle, or this is the, you know, it's not that we are, as philosophers say, obviously carving the nature at its joints. A lot of what we are doing is our interpretative behavior, and we should look at it as such. So now very briefly, the comparison of the therapeutic work with beliefs in this CT or classical CBT will have you second wave. The idea is, again, that we have these two elements, the attitude and the content. For example, I believe that my life is a failure. Of course, like here's simplification. I'm simplifying a lot just for the purpose of illustration of some basic facts. And the goal in therapy might be considered as this kind of belief carling. So I had belief with one content, I don't like this content, so I'm trying to get rid of it and replace it with a belief that it's false that my life is a failure. My life is not a failure. There's plenty of good things in my life, right? So this is one conceptualization of what we are doing if we are doing the therapy and working with beliefs. But another would be to focus, again, we have the same belief, but now we are focusing on the attitude. And I think that this is the third wave approach and the ACT approach. I have a content, and if my philosophical assumptions about, and not only philosophical and empirical assumptions about how the contents are organized, to what extent I can eradicate and extinguish elements of the relational framing, if they are right, it seems that I cannot get rid of the content itself. What I can do, I can change the attitudes toward this content, right? So what I'm trying to achieve is I'm trying to achieve the change of attitude from the belief attitude, again, the attitude that is oriented towards things that we take to be true and we behave as if they are true, to the to some other attitude, maybe the, you know, I have a thought attitude if there is such an attitude. But, you know, we know all these diffusion exercises. We know all them. The idea is to, by changing the attitudes towards content, again, distance a person towards the content, and maybe the role in the control of behavior of the client will change with this change of attitude. So again, I think I said most of these things, but let's take a look. The goal in RFT and ACT is not to change the content of beliefs by replacing one belief with another. The goal is to change the function played by a given content in the life of a given person. But the content itself remains available for relational framing. So it's not the case that I, you know, if I'm trying to, you know, I'm doing a lot of diffusion exercises on certain kinds of thoughts. It's not that the content will not reappear in my mind. It's still available for relational framing. It's just that it now has different function, and it's functioning differently in controlling my behavior. However, the believability is reduced, right? So exactly what I said. The person is less inclined to behave as if this content were true. So briefly, some conclusions. I tried to illustrate that one of the main philosophical differences between the second and the third wave concerns the understanding of the nature and organization of our beliefs. According to the conception underlying the classical CBT, it seems that it's possible, at least to some extent, to eliminate a given content from the system of beliefs and replace it with another. But according to RFT and ACT, it's impossible. All we can do is to change the function played by a given content in the control of one's behavior. So now going back for a moment to where we started, if we think about distancing, again, it can be interpreted in two ways. So distancing has place in in two different processes, both in the processes that we associate more with the second wave and the third wave. So first, distancing might be interpreted as an attempt to undermine a given content that leads to elimination or replacement of this content. So first I'm distancing someone, and then I'll be better able to knock certain content out and help knock another content in. And distancing, however, might be also interpreted in this other way, in this RFT way, namely as an attempt to change the function of a given content. So again, at least the distancing part, of course, will be there in both approaches, and no surprises. However, now convincing to the truth of an alternative does not fit, or the production of evidence, I think that it doesn't fit to the ACT or RFT perspective, right? Because we don't think that the way it works is that if I produce a sufficiently strong evidence for the falsehood of a belief you have, you'll be forced to revise your belief system. It's probably not like that, or the philosophical assumption underlying ACT and RFT doesn't seem to be in accord with that. So now there's the final thing, maybe a question to those of us who are practicing therapies. So, you know, again, about using and possibly combining these two approaches, and sometimes working more in the cognitive restructuring way, sometimes more in the diffusion way. You know, what is the function of my behavior as a therapist in a given moment? Am I trying to, knock out one belief and knock another belief in? So, or at least am I tempted to do that, right? Am I playing the belief carling, or am I doing something totally different? Yeah, so that's it. Thanks a lot for your attention. Here's a short bibliography, most of the things mentioned.
Thank you very much, Jędrzej. If you have any questions, you can write them in chat or ask for the microphone permissions. And before that, I would have a question, because your position within the ACBS, among other scientists or psychotherapies, is quite unique as a philosopher. And we have very few of those currently. And I'm curious, like, if you were to think about bringing more philosophers in to contextual behavioral science, how would you approach that? How to encourage philosophers to pick up psychotherapeutic issues in a way that would be up to date with current things that are interesting behavioral thinking, because there is a lot of philosophy in psychotherapy, but often it refers to some very old issues and discourses. So what would be your position on that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it also somehow goes back to this recent interview with Steve Hayes that I mentioned. So the Marcel and Steve are also discussing these kind of things. It's not about encouraging philosophers, but encouraging other psychologists from other traditions to kind of work in this tradition. And I think that unfortunately or fortunately, one of the most important things is, in a way, marketing, right? So, for example, I'm working and I've been trained in the tradition that's called analytic philosophy, and analytic philosophy somehow, you know, when there was the first downfall of the classical behaviorism, kind of nobody looked back. So it's all cognitive approach, and most of the thinking within this tradition is very close to, you know, all the cognitive talk, the talk using the mental terms, and the discussions mostly about, you know, the nature of memory, stuff like that, using these mental terms all the time. And maybe dispositionalism, for example, which is re-emerging now, it's something that kind of brings back the traces of behaviorism. And I think that there's plenty of traces of behaviorism everywhere, but it just, you know, people just react in a weird kind of way if they are told that what's done here is behaviorism. But again, this is, and again, now I'm going straight to what Steve Hayes was saying in the conversation with Marcel. A lot of that results from the fact that people think, you know, rats and pigeons when they think about behaviorism. And people are just unaware of the topics that behaviorism is now ready to confront itself with, right? So, I think that, you know, the worst kind of approach would be, oh, you guys philosophers, you discuss with cognitive psychologists about memory or about attention or about something. There's only behavior. No, it's not like that, right? So even if we are doing behavioral science or functional contextualism, again, to what Steve was saying, we want to have a language that allows us to, again, zero in on certain topics with the people who are using the mentalistic terms and stuff like that. So just as we shouldn't get rid of the notion of spirituality just because it is something that we used to associate with, you know, religious things and stuff like that. We might need the notion of spirituality. We might need a lot of mentalistic terms. Of course, maybe we don't have to take them literally, but sometimes in cases in which we want to get in the conversation with people for whom these notions are the best way of you know, getting to what they are interested in, maybe we should, you know, think about our ways of how to communicate these things best to them and how to present ourselves as behaviorists, you know, neo-behaviorists in the best way, so that they get that it's not only about rats and pigeons anymore, that it's about human beings, complex behaviors, organizations, societies, and so on.
All right. So what you are saying is that we need to like reach out to them in a way that would get them interested in showing the progress that the behaviorism has made. So it's not totally understood as a ancient part of philosophy or psychology that ended with Skinner.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
And also, yeah, just say that you know, as in any kind of relationship, saying we hear you, we are also interested in things that you call this and that, but this we are interpreting them as I don't know, just another behavior. But still, when we look at an organism that does certain things, it's not that only you are interested in these kinds of doings. It's that, yeah, we are all interested in the same things, just sometimes calling them differently.
And a follow-up to this question, and there are a few more waiting in the chat. So, so suppose philosophers do get interested in behavior tradition. What would be the advantage of having them on board? Like in terms of practice, of theory development, like how would you say, what would be the benefit of having a thriving philosophical discourse within a psychotherapeutic tradition?
Yeah, so let me start by saying why I think that philosophical activity is important, and then the question whether philosophers are important is another question. I don't want to defend it because, you know, I have an agenda. I think that a lot of things, when we read the first ACT book, when we read the RFT book, a lot of things that are going on there are philosophical in the sense of, you know, for me, philosophy is this kind of thinking about problems that is really not restricted by any kinds of constraints, right? So I have a problem, one solution would be kind of to solve this problem, because it's, you know, just do the steps. But another solution would be to ask, is it a good problem? Or, you know, like, this is, philosophy for me is the kind of intellectual activity, and you can have it on all kinds of grounds. It's a really non-restricted way of thinking about something. So it's not that you know, you will be cognitive psychologist, solve me the problem, because then you end up with a given set of tools. Philosophers are open to, you know, whatever kind. You know, there are philosophers who are saying there's free will, and I'll tell you how it works. There are philosophers saying there is no free will. There are philosophers saying it's not a good question whether there's free will or not, right? So I think that if we are building any kind of deep theoretical roots, especially for something that's actually supposed to be new, there's a lot of philosophical work going on. And I think that, you know, a lot of things that, for example, Steve Hayes is doing is pure philosophy. I mean, you'd call him doing philosophy. And now the question is whether we need philosophers. You know, maybe an argument could be quantitative, if we need more philosophizing to be going on, and it's difficult to train people simultaneously in psychologizing and philosophizing. We might need people trained in philosophy for some more philosophizing to be done. But again, I think that you know, of course, it's what's very important is for philosophers to be able to kind of tune themselves to the actual problems of the discipline. So you know, I believe that the philosophers who are kind of open to really hearing the specific problems that are to be solved might be useful.
Okay, the next question is from Barbara. Can you unmute yourself?
Very interesting what I saw, and I'm not trained in philosophy, so maybe my question is really, I don't know, not philosophical, but I'm glad that you're a philosopher and you're a fan of RFT. If we can go back to the slides where there are the examples of just a moment, Billy, little further back. Oh, here. Okay. Yeah. And, you know, when I look at it from my therapeutic point of view, my perspective, I see a lot of energy saving in RFT.
Yeah.
So if I would like to use philosophical language, talking about saving energy or time or whatever, how would you describe it?
Oh, yeah, very good question. So, so to understand you well, so you're saying that when you think about the kind of approach that is there behind RFT and ACT, it looks like it saves a lot of energy, right? So I think that this might be the case, or even a stronger claim might be the case, right? So if we, again, I'm simplifying the cognitive approach, and it's of course not so simple as knocking in, knocking out. But if this is the case, and also if the assumptions of ACT and RFT are true, that extinguishing is very difficult, it's, you know, one thing is that we might be saving a lot of energy because we are not trying to do something that's impossible. And this is
my point.
In general, it's like a very good strategy. If you are, you know, if you're trying to do something today, try and pick a thing that's possible to be done, like in general.
Okay.
But so this is under the assumption that it's really impossible to actually remove certain contents. And it seems that, especially that we know that we can target all our time, energy, and you know, our clients into doing something else that maybe somehow escapes our like initial take on that a little bit more, because it's not, you know, we will have these simple ideas about rationality that, you know, you should drop one and acquire another one. It's intuitive, and from that we get, at least I get, when I started reading ACT and RFT, I had a lot of the, like a big residuum of thinking of this way, you know, just have to get rid of this before you do X, Y, Z, right? And I mean, I get how people might think so, but it's a trap, right? And then there's a lot of ACT publication and research that are suggesting that this is one of the biggest traps that we are falling in. So yeah, the idea of when you find yourself in the hole, stop digging first, and you know, the kind of activity of replacing knocking out, knocking in will be just more of the same, more digging. On the other hand, if we are willing to try something new, maybe we should try and work with the attitudes instead, and let the contents be. Yeah, because what's important is not to get rid of the contents. This is not the, you know, we'll not win when we get rid of the contents. We'll win when, you know, things will start changing in our life.
Okay. I'm very curious about philosophers joining us. So thank you.
Thank you for the question.
All right, and there's also a question from Carl about what do you think about the differences between and similarities between behavioral terms like me relations, the deity relations, and schemas? Is it just using mentalistic terms in new functional ways? How do you see the differences and similarities between them?
So again, I think I'm going back to Steve Hayes, who knows one or two things about it. And I think that the idea is that it's not only about, as you mentioned in your question, this possibility, at least I hear it in this question. It's not only about which terms are we using, it's about how do we use them, right? So, you know, I think that one thing we do not want to have is, you know, these terms that there are plenty of things packed in them, and we have certain conceptualization of them. Like take beliefs, right? You know, we might have a bunch of assumptions about beliefs. Now the question is whether it's a good strategy to keep behaving as if all these conceptualizations were right. Because if we do, we will, you know, we'll do mentalism. But we can also keep talking about beliefs, and we should probably, because I don't know, our clients will be mentioning beliefs or thoughts and stuff like that. But we can do behavioral things or functional, contextual things about them, right? So we can consider their functions in very particular contexts. We can again think about them as certain patterns of behaviors, but again holding them lightly and thinking that maybe you know, this is actually, let me figure out, let me try and better understand the function of this thing. Maybe this is not the same thing. Maybe very often probably under one kind of belief, every client has plenty, and each of us have plenty of things packed in. We have to be able to kind of make all the necessary distinctions and follow the function of particular behaviors, react in appropriate ways. And I think the question concerned the behavioral terms. I think that it's similar. We can also kind of mentalize a lot of behavioral lingo, and you know, it's not behavioral anymore when it's mentalized. So the trap is still there. That's why we should probably, you know, that's why it's good that RFT, especially RFT, is an approach that's built on principles, right? So we do different stuff, and the constant question is not whether I sound as someone doing RFT because I hear the names of relations and stuff like that. The question is whether I'm doing the things that I'm supposed to be doing if I want to bring about the change RFT style or behavioral style.